Allora, benvenuti a tutte e a tutti. This particular binomio is in English, so I will briefly introduce the speakers in English. As it is typical of TITUBANTI TESTI, I actually don't introduce the speakers. They introduce themselves. I asked them explicitly, and asking them in particular why they decided to, the one to propose the text and the other to accept this proposal. So it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Goyette from Eckhart University in Florida, and Irene Salvo, who kindly accepted this very particular proposal. This is also Michael, you should know, this is the first post-antique text we discussed. Until now, we only had really ancient and late antique texts. So this is also particular. This binomio is particularly strange also from this perspective. So we are very thrilled to listen first to what Irene has to tell us. Since she's the one who accepted the proposal, she's going to speak as a first, and then Michael Goyette is going to present his his discussion. Okay, Irene, you are on. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint. You are free to share it.
No, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm very, very traditional, like no PowerPoint, sorry. So welcome everyone. And thank you, Marco, and thank you, Michael, for this unusual experience for me. And before we begin, I know that it's Friday evening, at least for those of us who are in Europe. So at the end of a quite exhausting week, I'd like to ask everyone to take a few seconds to close their eyes and relax the shoulders, the neck, and try to keep the spine upright, and be grateful for yourself for having reached the Friday in one piece at the end of November. So gratefulness is first of all for Marco, I have to say, even before thanking Michael. And because when he suggested me to do this TITUBANTI TESTI, it was like August. And I have to say that it wasn't a long time that we knew each other. So when he suggested me, do you want to comment on this text, Girolamo Fracastoro, the Syphilis? And the part of me said, yes, of course, while another half of me said, oh, he doesn't know me very well. I mean, I'm very skeptic. Why on earth I should say something on a Neo-Latin poet? I know nothing about it, never heard of him. And so I really was a bit skeptic and also a bit angry with myself. I was like, you know, middle of November is a very hectic period for you. You are teaching a lot this term. So why are you doing this to yourself? And that was the beginning of this experience. Then I started reading the text, and it was a completely surprise. I say, oh my God, he really picked up the right text for me to comment about. And it is this passage, but the text in the poem in general is exactly about what my interests are, about knowledge, about medical history, about miasma and purification. So at the end of very long days, I found myself reading Girolamo Fracastoro and truly enjoying myself. And so I'm going to share with you a few reflections about this text. So I usually do with poetry. So have been invited to focus in particular on book 3, but I'd like to invite you to look at the poem of this. I'm sharing my screen in case you don't have it at hand, but like the poem is very telling, as it often is the case with poems. So right at the beginning, we have this strange affliction that was completely unseen for century. So the Latin says morbum insuetum, nec longa ulli per secula visum. And so, but he really wants to explore the origin of this disease, explain the name, and most importantly, find a cure. And he is moved in this enterprise by their love of new things, amor. And this is really the main gist of the poem. But there is another important figure in the poem, who is the god Apollo. So I'll stop sharing for now, and I'd like to recall a few literary precedents that this poem reminded to me. First of all, didactic poetry. Didactic poetry, as most of you know, is a very established gender in Asian literature, and I have three models in particular came to my mind. The Hellenistic poets Aratus and Nicander, because they Nicander because of the theriaka, because of this need of explaining an illness and finding a cure, and Aratus because of the importance of observation to achieve knowledge, because this is exactly what Gerolamo Fracastoro does. He's a doctor before being a poet, and as a doctor and as a poet, he observes what he sees and then he describes it into poetry. Although I have to say that the English translation we have worked with doesn't really do justice to the poetry, because it is a prose translation and often appears more like a medical treatise rather than a poem. But I think that Gerolamo Fracastoro intent was really to have a work of art, a work of poetry, rather than a medical treatise. A kind of writing that he has done in other occasions. And together with didactic poetry, there are epic tones. In particular, in the passage in question, the talking bird reminded me of the eagle, Odysseus as an eagle in Penelope's dreams, and the cattle of Aelius when the birds are unjustly killed. Alongside these literary models, something very important is the role of gods and religion, and the relationship between religion and medicine, which is exactly in my field of study. So I was very much impressed. And but before I move to the specific of divine help, which would be looked at more particularly towards the end of my presentation, I'd like to focus on this idea of an illness that is unknown, an illness that is airborne, an illness that puts humanity in trying circumstances, but as long as they get experience and familiar with this disease, they manage to confine the contagion and to find a cure. And of course, my mind went immediately to the situation that we experienced in 2020 with COVID-19. And it's also interesting that the parallels between the stigma, the moral stigma, the moral implication around syphilis, and also like as a stigmatized disease, which was the case at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and the xenophobic tones of the title of this poem, like Sive de Morbo Gallico, so this syphilis or the French disease, that of course remind us of Trump talking of the Chinese virus at the beginning of the pandemic. And but yes, apart from the COVID analogy, it is impressive the modernity of Girolamo Fracastoro text, because he presents us a truly global history in the Renaissance, with these men traveling from both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, from east and west, and how quickly the contagion spread around. And what I find particularly interesting is the therapy for this disease, because what is, while in book 2 is explaining very specific medical treatments, much of book 3 is about the religious treatments of the disease, which reminded me very much of purification rituals in the Greek and Roman world, because we find a stream purifying the bodies, and most importantly, a sacrifice. And as it has been debated for ancient Greek purification, the core of the cathartic rite wasn't a purification done on the body of the person to be purified, but the killing of an animal as an offering to a god, who would then perform the purification. And this link between the divine help and the cure is evident in the prophecy of the bird, and the explanation that we get for the origin of the disease, which is an illness caused by divine punishment, because of the shepherd Syphilis not honoring the god Apollo. And again, Apollo is a god closely connected to the realm of contagion, pollution, and purification in at least in Greek religion. And also the cure as repentance, and the need for repentance that we find in this passage, and the link with ancient ideas of illness and cure, and that we find throughout antiquity up until the early imperial period. But to have more more overarching thoughts. I found a little bit of stoicism as well in Gerolomo's Fracastoro. Perhaps not exactly in the passage that we were that was selected, but mostly in book 2, in which he talks about purifying the mind and try to control your emotion and your negative thoughts. So this poem is very much imbued with ancient philosophical thought and ancient conceptions of pollution and purification, and I think it's not just about pollution and purification, but it's also about revenge and vengeance and worship of the gods, and how worshipping the gods, not properly worshipping the gods, can result in a disease. In terms of how the contagion spread about, in this passage we see these men and these that were very like this group of people who are sad with these wretched bodies, and they are really in need not just of a priest but also of nature. And the remedy is found, yes, in the sacrifice, but in the sacred trees, in the woods, in the secrecy of the shady forest, where there is this tree from where ointment and therapy will be found. And it continues with the praise of the trees and how beneficial is this tree to mankind. So I read also a holistic interpretation of what is health and how health can be achieved and can be obtained, and so there is clearly a connection between wellness in the body and wellness in the mind and wellness in the environment, and the risk of losing this wellness because of human contact. So Gerolamo Fracastoro is really careful about being a doctor that really see the disease within a wider context, within the wider environment, and he finds this combination between the agency of human knowledge and human observation and the potency of the gods and nature, and what they can do or cannot do for men and women and the like affected by disease. So these were my 2 cents on this text, and I really think that it will be a text that will continue to be in my mind, and I'm really committed to study this poem further, because I think it is not, at least it was completely unknown to me, but it offers a variety of reflection on not just medical history, like the history of syphilis, because I've learned that the name of the disease derived from Gerolamo Fracastoro, so he was the first to give a name to this disease, but also as an important point for the history of mentality, history of medicine, and how medicine interact with religious belief, and also look at, views of the environment and the relationship between the humans and the environment, and especially this idea of not thinking about just Europe or just Italy, but looking at the wider perspective and how disease could travel around the world, but at the same time how knowledge can travel around the world, because there is this meeting between the European soldiers and the native priests, and how do they exchange fears and knowledge, and also try together to understand what's happening to these wretched bodies. And as I say, last but not least, it is a test that could help us for better understanding the history of purification as repentance, as supplication, and so the complexity of pollution and contagion, that is not just a very specific cathartic rite, but as much in common with other religious expression like supplication and confession in its largest sense. And with this, I thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to hear from the real expert on this text.
Thank you so much, Irene. That was wonderful, and I wasn't expecting anything else than that. Thank you so much. Just let me add, since some of the participants asked me, where are you from? You are from Italy, but you work in the UK, University of Exeter.
Yes, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I am Italian, but I am since quite a few years at the University of Exeter. I am a lecturer in classics and ancient history, but my expertise is Greek religion, from material evidence inscriptions in particular. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. There is an interesting connection here, since I met Michael Goyette this summer in Palermo. Irene is also from Palermo, so as I am too. So there is this sympathetic Palermo community. So, Michael, we are very thrilled, very eager to know what you have to say about the text you so kindly presented to us, to our attention.
Thank you, Marco. Allow me to share my screen. Give me one moment.
And we also see actually the flag of Palermo.
Oh, yes.
Easily, sorry. Yeah.
All right, you should be able to see the handout I have here, yes?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Marco, for inviting me to participate in this series. And thank you, Irene, for your willingness to discuss this strange Neo-Latin text with me. I find it fitting to be participating in a discussion that bridges Europe and the US, since this passage itself involves a bridging of continents. To briefly introduce myself, I'm a professor at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's a small liberal arts college where I teach a variety of courses, many of which deal with ancient medicine, the history of medicine, history of science. And I became particularly interested in this text around the beginning of COVID. I knew about it before then, but shortly into COVID, I started developing a course which I now teach somewhat regularly called New Diseases in History and Literature. And this became part of that course. It was in many ways very timely, still is in other ways. And I could say a lot more about that, but I could also say a lot more about Fracastoro. In this entire text, I find him and the text extremely fascinating, but Today, I'll try to focus my remarks on the passage at hand and not go too much into context or background information. Perhaps there may be opportunities to delve further into those areas during the discussion period. But before getting into my analysis of the passage, one piece of background information that I would like to note is that this text, which was mostly written around 1518 and then published in 1530, contains what seems to be the earliest representation of indigenous peoples of the Americas in European poetry. And the passage portrays the very moment that Columbus's crew sets foot in the so-called New World, at the moment immediately prior to their first encounter with human inhabitants of the region. It can be argued that Fracastoro's representation of indigenous peoples is in some ways sympathetic to them, and that's something I'll discuss more later on. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that this text remains a part of the early history of mass illness, displacement, cultural destruction, and genocide wrought against the indigenous peoples of the Americas. One other piece of background information is that historians of medicine and epidemiology are still uncertain where syphilis existed prior to 1492. The Americas, Europe, both, it's still a bit of a medical mystery. Outbreaks started to occur in Europe prior to 1493, but there's evidence that syphilis could have existed there before. As we'll see with this text, Fracastoro, who is often considered one of the world's first epidemiologists, theorizes that the disease originated not in one particular place, but in, quote, the air common to all. So in looking at this text, I'm especially interested in Fracastoro's use of Latin poetry to present his understanding of contagion, which anticipates much later discoveries associated with the development of germ theory in the 19th century. With the passage we're considering today, I detect uses of language and imagery that resonate with representations of contagion found elsewhere in Fracastoro's text. Noting some of these echoes, I will then comment on the passage's intertextual relationship with a couple of passages from Virgil's Aeneid. I interpret these elements of the passage together as contributing to a commentary that Fracastoro's text makes on the relationship between colonialism, cultural violence, and contagion. So on my handout, I first have 3 passages that are meant to give a sense of Fracastoro's concepts of disease transmission and some of the language he uses to convey that. I'll go through those first 3 passages and then connect them with my reading of the passage from Book 3. So passage 1 contains, and this is, Irene also showed us this passage during her presentation. This contains the very opening lines of the text, an epic invocation in which Fracastoro announces the subject of his poem. Now I will sing of the varied accidents of nature and the seeds that have brought forth a strange affliction. Unseen by anyone for many centuries, it has raged in our time throughout Europe, parts of Asia, and the cities of Libya. It burst upon Italy in the wake of the sad wars of the French, and from that nation it took its name. A couple of observations here. The use of the word semina is interesting and recalls the vocabulary of atomism that we see in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. Lucretius is one of the major influences of Fracastoro, at least in this text. And it is significant here because it suggests that disease is caused by a material substance, a seed of disease, that is, rather than divine causation, and also rather than the concept of miasma. Miasma theory was a common idea in the history of understandings of disease transmission, where the air itself, the bad air itself, was thought to be the agent of the contagion. Here, Fracastoro is presenting us with something a little bit different, where it's the seeds or particles that can become lodged in the air that are responsible for the contagion. He also uses this language of bursting, erupit in the Latin, suggestive of a disease that can spread rapidly and in a highly destructive manner. Turning to passage 2, we can see that Fracastoro continues to develop his ideas about contagion here. This is just a little bit later in book 1, where he relates that air plays an integral role in the transmission of disease. For air is the father of all things and the cause of their coming into being, and it often spreads diseases among mortals, since in many ways it has, by virtue of its native softness, a tendency to decay, and thus it can easily contract infection and pass it on. Now I shall relate how the air became infected and how the course of centuries can transform things. Here we see Fracastoro presenting air as a particularly fertile vector for the transmission of disease. It is a substance that is particularly able to spread disease such as syphilis. And he also uses this language of contagion or infection. It's interesting to see that we have the translation of infection here. In some ways, that's a little bit anachronistic, but the Latin word that he's translating there is, well, here affectus, and then also contagia. So we see that air has a particular quality of a particular capacity to become infected. Turning to the passage 3, and I think I'll only be able to show the English here, at least initially. We can see that Fracastoro employs an epic simile to represent the spread of disease by means of contagion. As when a spark happens to fall upon some dried twigs from a torch that a shepherd has forgotten in a field, at first it is little and appears to be biding its time. Presently, as it gathers strength, it rises up and victoriously lays waste the harvests in the fields and the neighboring woods, tossing flames up to heaven. Far off some distant thicket, sacred to Jove, begins to roar, and for miles around the sky and the fields are aflame. Here, Fracastoro describes a spark, a fawila, igniting the twigs, the stipulas, as a simile representing the spread of disease by means of contagion. This produces a conflagration both on land and in the sky. And it is described in language of conquest with words like victrix and populantor and imagery of widespread destruction. So at this point, I'm going to turn my attention back to the passage from book 3, in which Columbus and his crew reach the New World and immediately begin shooting at birds, which are typically thought to be parrots. Here, one finds pieces of language that recall the language and imagery of disease transmission in the earlier passages, such as the reference to a fawila, a spark, and tinder, fomita, recalling the stipulas back in passage 3. The word fomita, which gives us the English word fomite, also reverberates with a passage from an epidemiological work that Fracastoro wrote in 1546, De Contagione et Contagiosis Morbis, on contagion and contagious diseases, in which Fracastoro states, I call fomites or fomites such things as clothes, linen, etc., which can foster the essential seeds of contagion and thus cause infection. Therefore, the action of shooting a firearm and committing unprovoked mass slaughter are described in the same language that Fracastoro elsewhere employs to describe the spread of highly contagious disease, as if pulling the trigger of the gun is the spark that rapidly ignites widespread death. Further imagery of contagion can be seen in the role that air plays in this passage, which is reminiscent of the qualities associated with air in handout passages 2 and 3. As soon as the crew releases its bullets into the air becomes singed with fire, micat ignibus aer, as though immediately contracting and passing on the sort of destructive force that is described in handout 2, or igniting the sort of celestial conflagration that's seen in handout 3. Moreover, it appears telling that the bullets strike and kill birds, which are, of course, airborne animals. In this way, Fracastoro shows how Columbus's crew, immediately upon their arrival to the New World, dramatically impact the air and other facets of the natural environment, and consequently bring about mass death through acts of gun violence, which are couched in language of disease transmission. These impacts also recall language connecting contagion with conquest, which we saw back in handout passage 3. Sorry, I have to keep skipping around like this. Victoriously lay waste, though, for instance. Indeed, the passage acknowledges that the Europeans have already done violence. They've already done violence, and it offers a warning or foreshadowing of their intentions to subdue these regions and a peaceful people long accustomed to freedom. In relating these impacts or potential impacts, Fracastoro's text appears to recognize the connections between gun violence, disease transmission, and the beginnings of European colonialism in the Americas. This passage also appears to interrogate the ethics of European colonialism and imperialism through its intertextual relationship with Virgil's Aeneid and the tradition of classical epic. As James Gardner observes in his commentary on the text, this passage draws influence from Virgil's treatment of the Trojans' arrival in Italy in Book 7 of the Aeneid. At the moment they begin to come ashore, Aeneas and crew are greeted by a peaceful group of birds in that scene. Even more extensively, Fracastoro's passage draws influence from the episode with the bird-like harpies in Aeneid Book 3. Both of these situations bring Aeneas and his crew into contact with a new land and a new group of people, and these interactions result either immediately or eventually in situations of violence that become part of the lore of the Roman Empire. By the same token, the violent actions of Columbus and crew in Fracastoro set the stage for legacies of violence, colonialism, and imperialism and the spread of disease in the Americas. In this way, Fracastoro invites comparisons between Columbus and Aeneas and the various ways in which each figure's actions impact indigenous populations. To examine this intertextual relationship a little more closely, let's look at handout passage 5, which contains a passage from the Harpies episode in the Aeneid. I call my comrades to arms, to war against the cruel tribe. That's the Harpies. They do as they are commanded. All conceal their swords beneath the grass. They hide their shields. And when along the winding shore, the shrill Harpies swoop down on us, Maecenas signals. His hollow trumpet sounds from his high lookout. My comrades now attack in the strangest struggle, hacking at these lewd birds come from the sea. No blow can wound their wings or scar their backs. Beneath the stars, they glide in headlong flight. They leave behind half-eaten prey and filth. Only one goddess, prophetess of misery, Chelino, perches on a towering rock. Her cry breaks out, "Sons of Laomedon, we let you slaughter oxen, kill our bullocks, but in return, you wage a war to drive the guiltless Harpies from their father's kingdom." Almost immediately upon arrival, the Trojan newcomers take up arms against the indigenous inhabitants they encounter. While the Harpies may not be an obviously sympathetic group, they regard themselves as guiltless as they attempt to defend their territory against the Trojans' intrusive and aggressive behavior. Compared with the Harpies, the birds in Fracastoro appear even more defenseless and unthreatening. And likewise, this literary juxtaposition makes the aggressiveness and violence of Columbus's crew appear even more extreme and unwarranted. At the same time, it seems possible that Fracastoro's intertextual engagement with the Aeneid may advance a critique not only of Columbus, but also Aeneas. To trace the line of influence back even further, it can be observed that the Harpies episode in Virgil is modeled in part on the story of the slaughter of the sun's sacred cows by Odysseus's men in Book 12 of the Odyssey, as Irene referred to. These actions, of course, lead to the demise of Odysseus's crew, a consequence which is interesting to consider in light of the Fracastoro passage. As with Odysseus's companions, Columbus's crew members are warned in Handout 4 that they will lose ships and few of you will return to your native fields. The bird who delivers this admonition speaks in a prophetic way, without mentioning any possible way this fate could be avoided. The insinuation seems to be that Europeans' acts of violence have already and will prove ruinous, not only for the birds and for others they wantonly attack, but also for the Europeans themselves, as if to say that acts of aggression and imperialism imperil the health and well-being of all. So to kind of wrap things up, I read these instances of intertextuality as a complement to the way in which Fracastoro incorporates language and imagery of contagion into his depiction of this scene of armed violence, with both elements of the passage intimating the potential impacts of colonial subjugation and the spread of disease. To my knowledge, no scholars have previously commented on the language and imagery of contagion that I find in this passage, but my readings of the text often concur with and expand upon conclusions reached by a scholar of medieval and Renaissance studies, Mary B. Campbell, in her article, Carnal Knowledge, Fracastoro's De Syphilis and the Discovery of the New World, which examines the text primarily in English translation. Campbell observes how Fracastoro's poem confronts the reader with what she calls, quote, an epidemiology of conquest, and how it, quote, reveals a Europe more nearly conscious of moral failure in the exercise of colonial expansion than the critiques of the new historicism suggest. There is a greater appreciation of loss in Fracastoro's poem than in many of our own contemporary narratives of New World exploration and exploitation. Campbell also argues that Fracastoro's poem offers a testimony to the, quote, inherent morbidity of the colonial relation before any European community had reached a consensus as to the nature or future of its contact with the New World. I find that these assessments are only strengthened when one examines Fracastoro's deployment of language in the Latin text, along with the allusions he makes to classical epics. In such ways, Fracastoro's poem seems to make some small steps towards humanizing indigenous peoples and toward giving value to their lives and well-being, while interrogating the ethics and impacts of European aggression and imperialism at the crucial moments of first contact and the beginnings of intercontinental disease transmission. I know I've probably already gone a little bit over time, but just to conclude, I have a chart and some figures that I thought it appropriate to conclude with that I think reinforce the actual historical impact of European colonialism in the first century after first contact, and that I think also reinforce the kind of impact that Fracastoro suggests in the passage at hand for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really interesting and inspiring. And as it is usual for Titubanti Testi, I give the word first to Irene, if she wants to add. I mean, it's not necessary, of course, but if you want to comment briefly upon my statement, and then we can open up the discussion to other participants.
Yeah. So no, thank you very much, Michael. But I have to say, I'm not agreeing with you entirely, and this is a bit odd because you are the expert and I'm not. But although your reading is illuminating, and it really puts on the foreground issues of colonial history and the impact on indigenous people, I do not think that this was the main aim of Fracastoro. I don't think that he was very much worried about what happens in the America. He was very concerned about Italy, about the Naples outbreak, about the local dimension of this disease rather than the global. So yes, it is open to the global, but he is very much interested into the local. And also when you talk about intertextuality, I really think that more than Virgil, Lucretius or didactic poetry are the real models for Fracastoro. It may be because I'm teaching a didactic poetry this module, so I'm all about poetry and teaching poetry and knowledge. But it really seems to me that he wants to write this poem for a specific function, which is so that future people affected by the disease can find a way to cure themselves, like a sort of self-therapy through Fracastoro poem, because he was a doctor, and this is the mission of a doctor, to help other people affected by disease to find a cure. And yes, I think that these are my two points, like the local intention, the local interest, and the didactic aim to learn about how to get the cure for these very disfiguring disease that, yes, it is contagious, but also creates a lot of isolation for those who are affected by the disease.
Okay, wow, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I'm sure Michael will be able to also to react to these observations, but we have two questions. The first by Craig, if I'm correct, and the second by Federico. So Craig, you are...
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Mike, for bringing this text to our attention. I'm so glad that I didn't get a chance to read the whole poem, but I will. Among other reasons, because as you know, and some other people know, I have an interest in precisely in Native American European literary interactions, and specifically Native American writers' responses to ancient Greece and Rome. So this was just great. And on that point, I just want to be clear. Maybe you can help me understand what the poem is saying. So I'm hearing both presenters, and I think I see this in the text, see that Fracastoro is giving a global view of this disease. The opening passage rejects the simplistic explanation that it came from somewhere else, right? Didn't necessarily come through commerce from somewhere else. Have I understood that correctly? And therefore, the passage with the bird in the Americas talks about a local outbreak of this disease in the Americas and the cure that they have developed.
Yes. First, I think it should be observed that there are some kind of contradictions in this text in terms of its ideas about causation, and there are different levels and layers of causation that are explored in this text, and they don't all agree with each other. But yes, in book 2, and this this really is a pretty short text for those who are interested in reading it. It's only 3 books. In book 2, we get a narrative of its origins in Europe. And then in book 3, we get a separate kind of mythical origin story for its origins in the Americas. One thing I find really interesting, though, is that both books also give us a cure. Book 2 gives us the cure of mercury, which was a very common treatment for syphilis during that time. But book 3 gives us the cure of a tree that the Native Americans offer to the Europeans, the guaiacum tree, as I think Irene alluded to, which actually ends up becoming the more popular common cure in Europe. It becomes considered the most effective cure. Whether to what extent it actually would have been helpful can be debated today. But it's, you know, in terms of like the global context, I find it very interesting that book 3 offers us a cure that kind of one-ups the cure that the Europeans had found on their own. And then it's a cure that's offered by indigenous peoples from the Americas themselves.
Yeah, and I was looking again at that the lines in book 3:1. This is the bird again, around line 190. So if I understand correctly, nexera manet vos illa dies, foidi ignoto cum corpora morbo auxilium poscetis. So the bird is prophesizing that the Europeans will get this unknown disease there in the Americas because of their violation of the birds, but they will also get the cure from there. So that's very interesting. I'm thinking of the vector of disease in that specific case, because as many of you know, or if you don't, you should know, it's very much alive in contemporary Native American communities and families. The knowledge of diseases coming from Europe and devastating Native communities, specifically smallpox, variolo, right? That's something that people talk about all the time today. So yeah, and I would love to talk with you some other time about the language, contagium affectus. I just don't know how those words work, and I'd love to talk, but we don't. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Federico?
Thank you. Thinking of both the speakers, I will talk about the title, in particular about the Irene's Salvo very good explanation. I feel the title as balanced, temperate, because it hints to the ill's biological and even national roots too. So the ill cannot fly from every radar, so to say. You know, I would like that. I will not like that. Even against the right fight against the xenophobia. What does it teach us? Xenophobia, preferring the only biological title, we fall into the opposite of error of endophobia against the infectors, like many states talking about the COVID 2020 pretended to have the only global remedium to COVID flu. So, and about the Latin influence by didascalic poems, the incipit reminds obviously that by Georgicon and the words seminarerum by Lucretius, and maybe about Georgicon, the book for the history of Aristeus is hinted, obviously, maybe no. So thank you.
Thank you. So you can, I mean, Irene and Michael, if you want to say something to both questions, yeah.
Maybe you could say something about these words contagium and affectus, because I noticed that this translation by Gardner, which to me seems a little inaccurate in a number of details, actually. It translates both affectus and contagium as infection. And I'm thinking of the etymology, contagium, adfectus. Those prepositions are very different from the English infection. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of contagium in its etymological sense, right? Touching, things coming into contact. It connects with the way that Fracastoro writes about fomites. there's a contact that has to happen. And one of the reasons I became interested in this passage is that it is a passage of contact between peoples that is implicated in the origin of the disease and as well as the treatment. But when I get a little bit more time, I would like to work through my own translation of these passages. And like I said, I think infection is a bit anachronistic. If I could just, I know because we're almost out of time, if I could just respond briefly to one thing that Irene said about the intertextual influence or Fracastoro's literary influences. I agree that Lucretius is the most prominent influence for Fracastoro. But with this particular passage, I was focusing more on the connections with Virgil because I see those connections being more prominent with this particular passage. There are intertextual connections with a number of other authors too. There's Ovid, there's Silius Italicus. For those who are interested in that kind of thing, Gardner's commentary does a really good job tracing the intertextual references in this text. But Lucretius is the most prominent.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your further comments. Just a quick note on contagium and this idea of the need of like contact. It is interesting to know to say that in Fracastoro interpretation there is no contact in the transmission of the disease because it's airborne. So I think it is very important when reading this text, try to put aside what we do actually know about syphilis and the fact that it is a sexually transmitted disease, because this is not in Fracastoro yet. So how the infection spread, it is then totally attributed to moral sins. And so if we want to focus on the passage in particular, it is very evident that the issue at stake is morality, is human behavior, is not doing the right thing towards the gods and towards Apollo. So a lack of respect, killing the birds, and so on. So so yes, there is a contagion which is actually spreading without contact.
Okay. Any other questions, observation?
If I could, I think that this idea of spreading through contact and moral guilt or a moral causation in this text are not mutually exclusive. I see Fracastoro as exploring multiple levels of causation and maybe in a sense over-representing the causation of disease. But it is complex, and I think that is part of the, in some ways, contradictory nature of the explanations that are offered in this text.
Right. I mean, a text is always much more complex than, and this is, I mean, TITUBANTI testi are particularly, as you know, devoted to precisely emphasize this uncertainty and this lack of, of certainty in establishing what is the message. The message. I don't like to speak about message in relationship to texts. Okay, if there is no other reaction to that, I would like to thank you very much, both Michael and Irene. That was just great. And I would like to mention the next Binomium on November 29th in Italian again, and it's about Ambrose hymn by Ambrose, hymn 10. And the interesting thing is that this particular Binomio is going to be handled by a Latinist and a specialist of migration studies. So a person not related at all to our field. That will be, I think, exciting. So I invite you all to come also next time. Thank you so much, both, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a lovely weekend without any disease.
Possibly, yes. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.